My name is David Supple. So I went to school to be an architect, basically. When I was in high school, I had an art teacher who showed us pictures of all these famous buildings she visited throughout the world. I had only been, where I grew up. I never had traveled to these distant lands, but I was just awestruck by how incredible these buildings were. And that really inspired me to create spaces that had that impact. That literally, I was just looking at a picture, never in mind being in the space, but just I was uplifted. When I got to college, that was just what I was supposed to do. I wanted to create those spaces, and that was the direction. Well, like, oh, then you should become an architect. So I got a degree in architecture. After I graduated, I started to work as an architect in a studio. And in a very short amount of time, I realized that I had no clue what I was doing. I felt extremely insecure. I had never built anything in my life, but my job was to tell folks what to build and how to build it. I was very deficient in that ability. Like those buildings I had seen pictures of, like, no, I could draw them, but no way would I be able to direct how to, put together a building. I attribute it to, it's like going to school, like you want to be a chef and you go to school for 4 years, you never cooked anything. But now your job is to tell folks what to cook and how to cook it. It didn't make any sense to me. And really, at that point, I really started to question, like, oh boy, I had all this theoretical information, but I couldn't do anything with it. And so, I set out to fill that void, and I just worked as a carpenter for a while. And I did that basically until I got fired. Like I never really made it to be an amazing carpenter, but I was really doing it as a student. I was really doing it to like learn. I would just work and then, go back and try to, fill that lack of information I had on how things, the practicality of how this, how things went together. And at that point, I didn't have a job, and I basically started a company, pretty much still with the intention to learn. So when I started New England Design and Construction, I would design something for a client, and then I would do all the work myself. And I would, I'd fill in where I couldn't, or get people to help me, but also kind of teach me at the same time. And around that time, somebody told me, they said, the derivation of the word architect means master builder. And sure enough, it's very true. It goes back to ancient Greek times, and it means, chief builder or master builder or chief carpenter. Archi is chief or master, and tekton is carpenter or builder. But I started to look in and just pull the string of like, well, how did this happen? How could this happen where this guy, goes to school for 4 years and then has no clue what the hell he's doing? How is that possible? The gist of what I found is that through all periods of time, the architect built. And, you go to different locations on planet Earth, they all speak different languages over different time periods. Obviously, architect, they don't have that word there. But if you do translate the word they had, it always came down to like the same meaning, which was chief or master builder. The Greeks got it from Africa. They got it from the Egyptians, like 110%. And the reason that has been denied is for the same reason that nobody knows the architect and builder used to be one and the same person. And it was for social status. For thousands of years, you go through, Africa, in Egypt, in Greeks, Romans, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, into, the Industrial Revolution. You look in an English dictionary, even up till the late 1800s, early 1900s, you look up architect and you look up builder. Those words are synonyms. They use each other's word to define the other one. What happened at that point? That's really when it changed. And at that point, there was a group of men in the United States. At that time, you're talking about kind of early mid 1800s. England was still a big influence on America. We had just gained our independence in the end of the 1700s. So there was still a big impact. And in England, there was this title called a gentleman. And per the definition of a gentleman, you could not partake in manual or physical labor. That was just a no-no. So what these builders, the best builders, architects, same word at that time, the problem they were trying to solve is that they could not reach this social status of a gentleman because they built. It was kind of hard to get away from that, right? When your product is a building, like it takes some manual physical labor to do that. And all of these gentlemen had risen up from the trades, from as carpenters or masons. And they got together and they were like, hey, this is the problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to reach this status, but we can't. So let's create a group. They called it the American Institute of Architects, the AIA. Their stated purpose was to raise their social status. That was their stated purpose. They went from wearing work clothes to suits. It was a PR play. It was really a play to position themselves with their clients and away from the building trades from which they all came. The other thing they did, the mid-1800s, it was openly acknowledged that the Greeks got it from Africa, from the Egyptians. Also a social status play. They changed the history books to make it so it started in Europe, so that, these temples, these incredible, the Parthenon just magically sprang with no influence from anywhere else. And they changed that because at that time, in the middle 1800s, you had slavery and you had colonization. And some of the founding members of the AIA had slaves. They got the way an architect was trained switch from that of an apprenticeship system to that of a theoretical university curriculum. And so one of the first things they did was they got this architecture curriculums accepted and adopted into major universities like MIT and Harvard. That's really what changed things. After a few generations of this, and initially there was, these guys built and they knew they were masters. They came from the trades. So the folks that trained directly under them, they were served pretty well. They got a lot of information from these individuals who really knew their stuff. But basically, you had a few cycles of this, right? You had a few graduates, and then they know a little less, and then they know a little less, and then they know a little less. Soon it becomes the blind teaching the blind till you get to guys like me, where it's like, oh my, it's like there is no practical, here's the product and you are responsible for the actual building. There was none of that. The other thing these guys did is because who writes the history books? The universities. And so they actually, changed the history books. And that's why nobody knows this, because these books come from these institutions, which must be correct. But they have really led us down a path that has brought us to a point that we need to get away from. And the institutions are not who I am looking to communicate to. I'm looking to communicate to a very broad audience and public and society, so that there will be a demand for change. And when the consciousness of enough people knows the truth, the institutions will change. But I've seen folks I admire tremendously talking to these organizations. They ain't listening. That's what I've observed, because it's their livelihood, and it's going to take a demand from society to say, hey, enough. This is not acceptable any longer. And then they will change. The fact that you have people like me who, spent years studying and then were completely deficient on the other side of it, needs to change, because our environment is important. To a large degree, it dictates our happiness, our well-being, how well we can perform at our jobs, how well we can raise our families. If that can be done more efficiently, if can be done for less money, faster, to a higher standard, that is going to benefit society tremendously. I'm extremely passionate about this subject, and I'm really just trying to fill in this kind of missing information. I don't think it's common knowledge, yet should be. And specifically in my industry, which is architecture and construction, I really have a strong purpose to unite and integrate and bring back together the industry. And the information that I wrote a book about and am talking about here today, once the truth of that subject is known, I do believe it will have the impact to bring back together this industry that I love.